Hey, one more thing before you go. What do you do when you have an illustrious career as an attorney and a judge, but you have this deep down desire to put words to paper? You become a novelist, just like my guest in this Friday fun episode. We're going to talk about reinventing your life as a novelist and creating a piece of work that explores old memories, betrayals, mistakes, missed chances, a look at how life could have been, all wrapped up in the middle of an impending hurricane. We're going to talk about the journey into creating this intriguing and unique novel. I'm your host, Michael Herst, and this is The Thing About the Last First Kiss. My guest in this episode is Walter Bennett. He's a writer and a former lawyer, a judge, and a law professor. His first novel, Leaving Tuscaloosa, won the Alabama Authors Award and was the finalist for the Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction and the Crook's Corner Book Prize for debut novel set in the American South. He has published short fiction and essays in both print and online journals, including Blackbird, The Cortland Review, Eclipse, and Voices. An essay on trout fishing, Black Quill, appears in A Stream, American Writers, on fly fishing. He has written numerous articles on law. It is a highly acclaimed book, The Lawyer's Myth, Reviving Ideals in the Legal Profession. And welcome to One More Thing Before You Go Over the Teacup. I am your host, Michael Herst. This is That Thing About the Last First Kiss. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You know, you and I have, as I said earlier, we kind of have an interesting background. We both come from a law background and ended up in kind of more of a creative field.
I would agree with that, although sometimes the law can be creative. as you probably
Yeah, I think in my career, in your career, both we've heard some very creative stories.
know. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that kind of grows on you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, before we get to your the meat of everything, I kind of like to get to know you a little bit more, and let our viewers and our listeners kind of get to know a little bit more about you. So I like to tell your story and how where you came from and how you got to where you're at. So where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which is a university town, where the University of Alabama is. My parents were both college teachers. I grew up in the 50s and early 60s. I came of age then, which was a very formative time for the country, and also a very formative time for me because of all the social change that was going on there. So it was a very meaningful time to grow up in a place where a lot was going on.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I had a younger sister, yes, and she is living in Durham, not far away from me right now.
So you obviously you don't live in Alabama anymore. When you just said Durham, you live in another state.
Correct. Yes, I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I wound up teaching law for some years back.
Well, you have an extensive legal background as a lawyer and a judge, and a professor, like you had just said. So, when you went to university, did you always want to be a lawyer?
No, I actually started out in English graduate school after college. I found out that I really love literature and reading in college, and planned to be an English professor. And I was in Vietnam for a couple of years between college and graduate school, and I remember being in a foxhole near Quezon, sending in my application to University of North Carolina Department of English, and went there with the idea that I would stick it out and become a professor. But I found out that English graduate school was hard work, and it was not nearly as much fun in terms of enjoying literature, I thought, as undergraduate school was. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be grinding it out, I may as well get into something that'll pay me some money and get me a job. So I bailed out and went to law school. That's how that came about.
Well, that's that's interesting because I figure I would assume law school would be more difficult than being an English major.
Um, in some ways, yes, but it was also, and this may surprise you, I found it more creative than graduate school, in English graduate school, at least as it was then. And
Right.
um, just there were so many more opportunities. You thought on your feet. You reacted to things. You engaged with other students, and it was much more active and uh, place. And I thought, again, I thought it was a little more creative. Maybe not necessarily in a good way, but I thought it was.
I mean, and you started your career as a lawyer,
That's right. I
defense
started my.
lawyer, or prosecuting.
I was mainly a civil rights lawyer and did some criminal defense. I never prosecuted. I did some civil litigation, but I was a courtroom lawyer fundamentally the whole time I practiced.
That's interesting. That's cool. As we said earlier, we both share a background in law. Actually, mine is from a different perspective. But when I first went to school, I actually went to school to be a journalist. My father was a journalist, so
Oh,
everybody said, "Oh, you got to be a journalist. Your dad's a journalist. You got to be a journalist, right?"
right,
I
right.
took about a semester of that, and I went, I saw the guys over there, in the police academy side of it, and I went, I think that looks more fun.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So yeah, I switched, and much much to the dismay of my family, but ironically enough, after I left the police department, I've gotten back into writing. So yeah, roundabout, the whole circle came full circle, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, and of course, both of my parents were college professors, so that's probably why I leaned in that direction first.
So what got you first interested in had you always wanted to be an author, for example? What got you interested in writing?
Well, I think when I went to college, I really was so taken with literature and reading, and I hadn't had a lot of exposure to that in any deep way before I went to college. And I thought, wow, if I could do anything I wanted to do, I would be a writer. But look how smart these guys are and how brilliant they are that we're reading, and they're all geniuses, and I'm nowhere near that level. So I got to find a different way to make a living, and so that's sort of where the desire began. But of course, the reality of it was a little too much for me to take on at the time.
Yeah, I definitely 100% understand. It's um, I when I first got out of law enforcement, I went into screenwriting because I thought, I actually took a novel writing class. In the novel writing class, you had a one-on-one with everybody and
Wow.
with the teacher. So I got up to my one-on-one, and she said, "This novel sucks." I went, "Thanks, thanks for being honest." Right? She said, "Actually, it would make a better movie." And I said, "Well, I love writing movies. I love watching movies, so maybe I could write a movie." So I kind of leaned toward the screenwriting side of it, and kind of developed a couple of screenwriting conferences, and then we developed a couple of film festivals and wrote a documentary and all this kind of thing. So, but we got waylaid with injury, and that kind of put that
Yeah.
on the shelf for a little bit. But I'm back to writing, so it's all good. It's all good.
It's
It's all
good.
good.
And having a teacher, a writing teacher, to tell you that something you've written sucks, it's not necessarily a bad beginning, and not an
Oh,
unusual one either.
exactly. It was kind of like one of those things where it's like, okay, thanks.
Right.
At least you didn't say this is sucks. Get out of my class. Get out of my office and don't ever come back.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So it's. I know that you've written both the nonfiction and fiction both. So did you start out with the nonfiction because of your profession? I'm assuming.
Well, I guess I was trying, off and on to write fiction. probably in the 90s and late 80s and 90s, but there was nothing very serious about it. I think that my efforts, those efforts, as halting as they were and insufficient, were a prelude to writing the book I did on the legal profession, which is based in large part on the idea of story and the effect of myth and mythology on professional life. So I think that they both sort of informed each other, but I'm not sure I could have written that nonfiction book without first having an interest in story and fiction, and particularly myth, which is what I was interested in at the time. Myth being a way of expressing a culture expressing its ideals. So I guess that's sort of how that came about. Nothing is any, perfectly linear progression. It all sort of rumbles along and things happen. I'm not sure.
Everything happens at the time it's supposed to, right?
I hope that's right.
I believe that I'm hoping it's right.
Yeah,
At least that's what I keep getting told and reaffirmed. We'll have to see. The journey is still on its way, right, for both of us. So I guess
I think that is true. We're never over, I would say. Yeah.
exactly. Um, so, what motivated you to write your first fiction book? Because when you go from. I mean, I've written nonfiction, and but I've never written a fiction book. I've written stories when I went through those classes I told you about. So, kind of, what motivated you to write a fiction book to go that direction?
Um, I think it goes way back into my childhood because when I was a kid, um, on both sides of my family, relatives, uncles, grandparents, and neighbors even were all storytellers. And when I was 11 years old, I got sent up to my grandfather's tobacco farm near Danville, Virginia, um, every summer until I became 16 and could get a job in Tuscaloosa. And those summers, on weekends, Sundays usually, people would gather on the front porch and they'd tell stories about the family, about characters in the community, about old bird dogs or something. It was a
Right.
constant flow of stories, and I just got that way of communicating and passing on information and connecting with people in my head. So I think that's where it began, and I started telling stories to myself and redoing the stories that I had been hearing. And start turning other information I was getting into stories. I think so. It just sort of bubbled up from all of that. The incident that the first novel is based on is based upon an incident that occurred when I was a teenager in Tuscaloosa, and this is a tough story to tell. But I was in a car with I think three, maybe four other teenage boys, all of us white kids, cruising around on some weekend night. And we went through a black section of town, which was just a way we went to get from one place to another. And there was a young black guy, walking along the side of the road. And one of the guys in the car with me had a carton of eggs, and he brought those along for one purpose, and that was to throw it at people. And particularly, I think, although this was not stated, I don't think when we started, at black people. And I'm guessing, although I don't recall specifically, that that's why we were there. Anyway, he threw the egg, one of the eggs, and hit this black guy walking beside the road in the back of his head. Um, and we sped off, and the guy chased us. And I remember, I was in the back seat. I remember turning around and looking, and here's this black guy chasing a carload of white kids up the road. He had no chance of catching us, of course. But something about that and what had happened, what we had done, sort of turned a turret in my head, and something clicked that life was very, very different from what I had been imagining that it was. It was much more complicated than that, and that I didn't really know much about it at all. And I had almost no understanding of how it felt to be someone else. I mean, I guess it was my first inkling of real empathy for someone else, and particularly someone of another race who had been humiliated by the horrible thing we had done. And that's really stuck with me. I think memories like that, that are shameful and painful to you, really hang. And so that's where that novel began. And I don't know how much you know of it, but the scene I've just described of the kids in the car throwing an egg at the black guy um, is probably the second or third chapter in the novel, after sort of the introductory part of it, and that begins a story. So that story stuck with me over the years, and I realized I tried to write novels about other things. I realized that I had to write that story before I really could go do something else. Um, so yeah, that's where that one began.
It's very profound, actually. Is that what would that motivate you to become a civil rights lawyer?
I guess that, and the fact that my parents were college teachers. My father taught at the University of Alabama. My mother taught at Stillman College, which was an all-black college in Tuscaloosa. They would have been absolutely horrified if they knew what I was out doing that night. I mean, any sort of racial
Right.
statements that were derogatory in any way were totally forbidden in our family. So all of that, I think, my background of the parents being sort of, at least in that era, liberals for their day, and my own experience of hanging with folks that just weren't like that, and behaving like they did, and then seeing how bad it was. Yes, I suspect that had a lot to do with me becoming a civil rights lawyer. Yeah.
It's interesting. We grew up in kind of the same arena. I I'm getting some feedback here. Hold on a second. I'm going to pause this. Here we go.
Okay.
So yeah, I remember I grew up. I have a lot of family from the South, Mississippi in particular, and I grew up in an environment where my father was from Pennsylvania, and my mother's side of the family was from West Virginia, but my grandfather, all of his family were all of his family were Southern, and it was difficult to grow up in that era and be friends with black people because of the environment that was there. I am not racist, and I got in a few scuffles for being friends with black people, unfortunately, at that time. But I commend you for standing up for that. That's a positive thing. So thank you. When you started writing your fiction in nonfiction, obviously, do you have a preference? Do you really enjoy writing the fiction now more than nonfiction, or are you okay with both?
I enjoy writing fiction more now. There's more risk in it, and you really are sort of out there winging it on your own, and there's no limit to where your imagination can go. I think, at least for me, writing nonfiction, and the nonfiction, of course, that I was writing was quasi-academic, so
Right.
it was much more
Stringent.
stringent and restricted, I guess, in terms of what I could do than other nonfiction. I've been reading some nonfiction recently that is wonderfully, beautifully done and very imaginative and just terrific writing. So I guess that when I say nonfiction, I'm talking about the kind of nonfiction I did, which was about lawyers and the legal profession.
Well, and I agree with that. It's I think anything that's not any technical manuals, any educational manuals, any academic manuals are all nonfiction and so forth. Um, I prefer reading fiction than I do nonfiction. Unfortunately, obviously, going through university, I had to read a lot of a lot of nonfiction and academic, and I had to write a lot of academic. And I kind of agree with you. I kind of like the fiction side of it much better. So, are you married?
I am.
Do you have
Uh,
kids?
I have two kids. One's a lawyer, although she does not actually practice. She is an advocate and works in an advocate's role with Pew Charitable Trust. And my son is an editor, freelance editor.
Very cool. Got a little mixture of both.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, that works. What was your motivation for, let's say, the book now? I mean, what was your motivation to kind of write the first last kiss?
Well, that sort of fell together. I've been working on another book, another novel. In fact, one that I'd started even before the first novel, Leaving Tuscaloosa. And this novel that I have been working on for so long is a tough novel, very involved and complicated. And I think I reached a point where it wasn't coming very well. And then suddenly this other story began to intrude, which is the one that became The Last First Kiss. I think that came out of two things. One is I ran into my high school sweetheart at a high school reunion, and we sort of, began to talk about the old days. And I began to realize how important at that time in my life that relationship was. It was a young love thing, but it really transformed me because I was wandering in the wilderness when I was 15, 16, 17 years old, absolutely in a totally lost adolescent trance. I don't know what would have happened to me if I hadn't found something to get me straightened out. And then about the time that was happening, I had lunch with a friend of mine named Craig Nova, who's a terrific writer in his own right. And he'd been to visit a house that we own on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and he said how much he liked being there. And I said, well, it's a nice place, but it's doomed because the sea's rising, storms are coming in, and sooner or later that house will not be there. And he said, wow, that's a terrific idea for a story or a novel, a doomed house. So
And you're
these
talking
two
about
things,
his house.
right? Well, he did. I got to it before he did, but those two things sort of came together at the same time, and so I thought, okay, so these two folks get together and they spend the weekend in this doomed house. Now, how do I bring that about? And so that's how it started.
That's pretty interesting, actually. And as a domestic violence investigator for 4 years, I got to ask this question: did that cause any rift between you and your wife?
Oh no, 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 not at all. Yes, actually, she is the former sweetheart. I mean, that was many, many years ago. She and my wife are also friends. In fact, they knew each other before either of them knew me.
Yeah, it's I'm actually this week I spend my 32nd wedding anniversary, and we're still friends. My wife and I both, and my kids are friends with my ex-wife. So uh,
That's
life,
great.
yeah, life is good. That's the way it should be, right?
Right. Yeah, I've done some domestic law, and believe me, that's not the norm, but
That's
it's
not
great.
normal. No, I say 4 years of domestic violence task force. Yeah, that's definitely not normal, but it really should be. It's
Yeah.
just sometimes things don't work out. Sometimes things work out for the better in another way. So it's all
Yeah.
good. What do you do to prepare for writing a fiction book? I mean, what's your process?
Well, I don't know that I. Yeah, I wish I could say that I have this uh, ritual or some sort of progression that I go through to get ready to write something. I don't. And I think I pay for that because I spend a lot of time as I go reconfiguring what I'm doing and trying to flesh out the story and having to drop a lot of things that, don't go anywhere. So it's a lot of fumbling about with me. Um, I admire writers who can tell you before they begin a book what the ending is going to be, and they know that, and they know how they're going to get there. And I have a vague idea usually,
Right.
but I have to write the story to find it.
See, I think that that would be the hardest part about writing fiction is kind of. I mean, when you write an academic paper or you write a nonfiction book, you lay it out. You know what you're going to put into it. You know what the beginning is. You know what the end is. You know how to fill it in the middle. And in a fiction, I think you would have to have. And this is hopefully I'll learn something here. You have to. Do you think you have to have the whole thing laid out? Like I know that I want this to be the ending, or and that's what I'm working towards.
Yeah, I do not have the whole thing laid out, and this in this last book, I wasn't even sure whether these two people who spend this long weekend together, were actually going to wind up together. And then it became fairly clear as I neared the end that if this was going to be a story with an arc and an ending, that probably had to happen. Although I've been told by other writers that no, it didn't. You could have ended it without that, and it would have been okay.
But you've got a lot of good, great reviews on the book, so I would take reviews. Everybody's got an opinion,
All
and
right.
everything, as you know, is going to resonate with other people. So the reviews that I've read on it have all been very positive.
Well, thank you. Yeah, they've been good. I've been very pleased with that.
Do you think
Actually,
from your
go ahead.
first book to this book, do you think it got easier?
I'm sorry.
Do you think from your first book to this book it has gotten easier?
No, uh, no, it has not gotten easier. It's still a real uh, struggle for me a lot of the time, and that's okay. I find out that that's just part of the process with me. Um, the trick is when I really start to struggle, or when I think I've hit a dead end, is to not give up and to come at it again. And sometimes that means leaving it for a little while and then coming back.
From that perspective, yeah, I remember my father writing a novel, but unfortunately he passed away before he could finish it. But I remember it was in a drawer, and it was like, don't touch this drawer. That was the golden rule, right? Leave this drawer alone.
Right.
It's like, hey, I just want to see what you're doing.
Yeah, that was back when you saved something, you had to print it out, or you had to type it out and
Yeah,
keep
you
it in the
could.
drawer. Right.
Yeah, you messed that up. It's done.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah. That was interesting, Jonathan. Unique memory I just had.
Yeah.
The do you still teach?
No, I haven't taught since I guess I can't. I've almost forgotten exactly what the date was, but it was sometime around the 2001 or 2002. It's been a long time since I taught.
You've been writing since then.
Yep, writing. Uh,
It's a great
and
way to retire, right? And sit back, relax, write your story, and
Well, yeah, except that it's not really relaxing. No, it's people ask me, to compare sort of the workload of writing and lawyering, and for sure, and even law teaching, for sure, it's much more intense. I mean, for a long periods of time as a lawyer and judge and so forth. I mean, you really are on the job, and you got to be there. But as a writer, you get, or I get, and I imagine a lot of writers do, totally lost in it, and your mind doesn't stop. I mean, it really keeps writing, and I wake up at night, and stories are coming, or something has broken through in the story. So I guess that's true in a lot of professions, but with writing, it does really seem to never really let you go. You just sort of always doing it or about to do it, or it's going on in the back of your mind when you're trying to carry on a conversation with someone.
All right. Do you write every day?
I try to, and that's important. And that is even on weekends. Although of course, I miss days and I take off and do things. But um, yeah, I think it is a discipline, and it's important for me to look at it that way. Uh, so yeah, I try to write every day.
On your process, do you because I just from other authors I've spoken with, do you edit as you go, or do you just put it all out, let it sit there, let it fester, and then go back and edit?
A little, I guess I do both sometimes. Right now, I am working on what is probably the 20th or 30th draft, at least I'd say the 20th or 30th draft of this big novel I was telling you about. I've had complete drafts of it a number of times and decided it wasn't right. Um, and so I'm revising every day is a revision of that. It, I reach places where I just scrap what's there and start over on a chapter, but that's all revision. When I'm writing sort of a new story that I've not been over before, um, I go in fits and starts. I'll write um, what uh, has come to me, and then if I start to, if I get stuck, I may go back and work my way back up again. So I think I don't have a formula that you know applies every day. I might do something different every day just to get back into it and go from wherever. Um,
Yeah, I think that
Yeah, I
you
think that you
it would
it would
be
be
difficult
difficult
to
to
try to edit. I mean, I used to be really when I was doing my papers in college, for example, in university, and I'm sure a lot of people do the same thing. I would write a page and then go, wait a minute, there's a mistake up there. And then I go back and fix the mistake. And then I go, well, there's another one. Or there's this. No, this doesn't sound right. And it used to take me forever when I first started writing papers for university, for my master's degree especially, because they needed to be so, precise and cited and, this kind of thing. And I finally had to learn just write it
yeah,
and then go back all at once and have to fix it because I was spending hours. My wife be going, "Are you coming to bed yet? 2 o'clock in the morning, please."
yeah, yeah,
So yeah,
yeah.
that's
I think you could, and I try to avoid this. I think you can get so focused on making everything you've done right that you don't keep moving forward. And when I'm doing that, I'm in trouble. I need to. The story needs to keep going.
I agree with that. I agree with that. It's interesting. Do you miss practicing law?
I do. Well, I haven't really thought about it a lot recently, but I really miss practicing law. I miss being in a courtroom, and you know as well as I do, it's a place of high drama and
Yep.
stories unfolding all the time. And I'd got to the point before I stopped actually practicing law that I was really I felt comfortable on my feet, and when I walked into a courtroom, I felt like I knew what I was doing, and I was competent, and I wasn't intimidated, and that was a really good feeling. Um, and then, not long after that, I became a law professor, and that was sort of the end of most of my trial lawyering.
Changes perspective.
Yeah,
Definitely changes perspective. Yeah, I had friends of mine that they are still off. They were still officers, but then they moved to the police academy as an instructor, and they kind of went, I really missed the street. When I left the police department, I didn't want to retire because I retired with a disability. I didn't want to leave the street. In fact, we'd be driving home and I'd be calling cars in, and they're going, Sarge, you're making more arrests now than when you were working. You got to stop this.
right, right.
So just retire, go relax, go sit down, go have a cup of tea, go have a cup of coffee. Yeah, it's difficult to kind of move forward, but I'm sure that getting lost in your fiction, getting lost in your writing, kind of helps.
For sure, yeah. And I keep thinking, I keep asking myself, why have I not written a novel about law, about a case or a lawyer? And there is a lawyer that appears in this a big novel I'm working on. He's a 19th century, Civil War era lawyer. But other than that, I haven't done that. But you know, one thing that law and writing fiction have in common is stories, and they're both just alive with stories. And so I see a continuity there. It's a very different approach, of course.
Yeah, I agree with
Yeah, I
that.
agree with that.
It kind of
It kind
allows
of allows
for
for
creative writing
Right.
from that perspective. It kind of gives you a new idea of how you can incorporate things and so forth. Um, what do you recommend to other writers who are like just jumping on this train, basically this writing train?
People have asked me that, and that question catches me totally by surprise because I can't imagine I have anything to say to a writer that would be very helpful other than, if I can do it, you can do it because I went about it in such a haphazard way, and I still go about it in a fairly haphazard way. And you don't have to be brilliant to write, but you do have to be conscientious, and you have to keep at it, and you have to keep trying, I think, to change and improve what you do. I went to a lot of workshops and had some really good teachers. And what I found was that they pretty much, Lee Smith, a friend of mine and a terrific writer and writing teacher, said that what she felt she had to do as a teacher was give people permission to write and encouragement to write. And I think that is sort of the first step. And you've got to do that for yourself too. I mean, you've got to give yourself permission and encouragement because most of the time, unless you really are successful, you don't get it. I mean, you're spending most of your days alone, and and it's a it's very easy to be self-critical and create all sorts of self-doubt because again, unless you're famous and you're publishing regularly and in demand, you don't know whether anybody's going to read what you're writing or not, and if they do, whether they'll think it's worth anything or not.
Yeah.
So sticking with it, uh, don't being discouraged, finding the story you want to tell, trying to gin up a story or conjure a story from somewhere is tough. I think that it needs to come from something that really grabs you. And with me, that's memories in my past that engender a story. Um, Not necessarily about me, but engender a story that I can tell.
Well,
So
plus you have from the first book that you wrote, and even the last one that the first last kiss, it comes from personal inspiration, personal experience that you've turned into a broader spectrum of love and understanding and compassion and empathy and opportunity and life journey.
I think that, yeah, I appreciate that statement. And that's what I would like to think I'm doing. And uh, without appearing to be a self-focused or narcissistic or even a true to life recounting of what I experienced or the story that got things going. I think that's right. Um, so
What inspires you?
um, I think what you said about the life journey, I see both of the novels I've written, and for that matter, the book on the legal profession, as largely about people coming to consciousness about themselves and about other people and about the realities of life. Um, and beginning going back to that story I just told about um, that night in Tuscaloosa when I was involved in that incident that affected me so much. That was a seminal moment of coming to consciousness for one of the first times in my life where I really came awake. And I think when I began to understand what happened in that on that evening and what happened to me that evening, I think I've tried to see my life as as you've said, a journey where you become more and more conscious of yourself and people around you and life. Um, and so the last novel, which takes place uh, between these two people in their 70s, they are looking back over that journey and trying to figure out what happened in their lives. And that process, I hope, if the story is told correctly, is a coming to consciousness story for them, even in their elder years. So yeah, I think that's the inspiration, is trying to find a deeper level of consciousness by writing and trying. You know that there's a terrific book on William Faulkner out called The Saddest Word, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author now. It's a great book. Anyway, he concludes about William Faulkner, who said some very embarrassing racist things in his life, that his fiction was much more incisive about race, much more humane and understanding about racial relations than the author himself was as a man. And I think that in the best of times, writing fiction takes you to a deeper level of consciousness about humanity and life and all sorts of things than frequently some of us, at least I think I'm in that category, are able to do just by walking through life and washing dishes and taking out the garbage. So, two of my favorite jobs.
Yeah, that's yeah. I've been there, done that. Yes, I understand. Well, that's a great. I mean, that's profound. I like that. I appreciate that. Let's talk about how someone can find you, more about you, and how to find your books, especially first, the last first kiss.
Well, it's available on Amazon and through Bookshop, which I urge people to consider because it's a Association of Independent Bookstores. So you support the smaller independent bookstores by buying through Bookshop. Um, my website is http colon / colon www.walterbennetauthor.com, and it has a lot of information about me. And in fact, you can click on either Amazon or Bookshop from the website and purchase the novel. So I hope that website is comprehensive enough that it tells you what you might need to want to know about me, and also it tells you where I'm going to appear for readings and so forth. Hopefully this fall, if COVID will allow that, and if not, maybe in the spring.
Well, and I'll make sure I have all that in the show notes for everybody, so it makes it easy for them to click on it. They'll take you right to your website, and that way they can find out more about you, your books, and how to get them, as well as your appearances and so forth. So I'll have that there. Walter, this is one more thing before you go. So prior to us going, do you have any words of wisdom you'd like to share?
Uh, no, I don't know that I do, other than what I've tried to say, except that writing is a splendid way to spend time. And I urge people who have the urge to do it to give it a try if you haven't. And if you have, stick with it. And you just never know what will come up.
Those are good words of wisdom, I think, and especially nowadays when, like we just spoke about earlier, my dad used to write with a typewriter. I used to write with a typewriter. If you messed up, it was a pain in the butt. Now you have a computer. If you mess up, you start over.
Right, you hit the delete button. Yeah, and don't have to use that little white paper you used to have to put in the typewriter.
Exactly, or the whiteout.
Right. Yeah,
Oh yeah, the good old days, right?
right. Yeah.
Walter, thank you very much for spending this time with me, and I really appreciate it. I think that you have some amazing talent, and I think everybody should check you out and look for your books and check out the first one and the last one, First Last Kiss. And I again thank you for sharing your journey with me and with my audience.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate you. Please be sure to follow us, subscribe. It's free. You can find us not only here on YouTube, but on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Pandora, and any of your other favorite listening platforms. Please download our free app in the iTunes Store and on Google Play. It's free. You can take one more thing before you go anywhere that you go. Compliments of SuperPass, our sponsor. You'll find all the details in the show notes and on onemorethingbefore.com, as well as beforeyougopodcast.com. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to this episode of One More Thing Before You Go, a unique conversation about life. If you like our show and want to know more, check out our website at beforeyougopodcast.com. That's beforeyougopodcast.com. Tell your story, share your expertise, contribute to the blog, and subscribe to the newsletter. You can find us as well as subscribe to the program and rate us on your favorite podcast listening platform.
And one more thing before you go. Have a nice day, have a nice week, and thanks for listening.
One More Thing Before You Go, a unique conversation about life podcast, is a creation of One More Thing Productions, established 2010, all rights reserved.